Hello, my name is Mike Searson, and I am a volunteer who does online classes for the American Red Cross. As a way to meet some of the volunteers who are not able to make a live presentation, we decided to do a pre-recorded session. So this is the pre-recorded session for one of the orientations, and so therefore this is called the Disaster Volunteer Orientation, and we hope that you enjoy. We'd like to communicate that we really do appreciate you taking the time to volunteer with the American Red Cross. We know that there are a wide variety of options that you can do with your free time, so it is very much a joy that you are spending your time with the American Red Cross. So what will we talk about today? We're going to talk about the following. We're going to talk about the American Red Cross mission. We will talk about the geography or table organization. We will talk about steady state versus operational state. We will talk about the group activity position or gap chart. We'll talk about the opportunities in disaster, kind of dive in on that. We'll talk about the mass care sheltering need. And then we'll talk about the volunteer connection, which will be your website to access volunteer resources that's connected to the American Red Cross. We are going to look at two different features. We're going to look at how to enter your hours and the EDGE system. And then we'll finish off the presentation by describing our next steps. Many organizations will have a mission statement that will organize the personnel and the activities of that organization. And the American Red Cross falls within that same pattern. So the American Red Cross has the following mission statement. The American Red Cross prevents and alleviates human suffering in the face of emergencies by mobilizing the power of volunteers and the generosity of donors. You may see off this mission statement. There are two phrases in bold. One is the power of volunteers and the generosity of donors. Think of these as two pillars that really help the American Red Cross. First, the power of volunteers. Volunteers are very important to the American Red Cross. What I've heard is about 90% of the positions of the American Red Cross are volunteer positions. So if it wasn't for the generosity of volunteers willing to donate their time, the organization of the American Red Cross would be a lot more smaller organization than it is today, and a lot less able to help people. The second pillar that you'll see off this mission statement is the generosity of donors. And the reason why donors are so important is it is the main revenue stream of the American Red Cross. It provides the financial means to allow the American Red Cross to do what it does that requires money. And you're seeing a few pictures right here of some of the activities that the American Red Cross does. The next two slides give some information about how the American Red Cross is structured geographically across this nation. The American Red Cross is headquartered in Washington, D.C., and we are an independent organization. We are an independent Red Cross association that shares itself with other independent Red Cross associations spread throughout the world. We organize ourselves across the United States into we organize ourselves into three levels of organization. As you go through these three levels of organization, you will notice that we will get more localized, more focused to a local area. So the first layer of organization is called division, and you sort of see the wide areas of territory that is referred to as division. So you have the Pacific, you have the Northeast, you have the Pacific, you have the North Central, the Northeast, that type of thing. Then the second, if you will, layer of organization is called regions, and we are from the Nebraska-Iowa region. So essentially it's the states of Nebraska and Iowa put together. And then the third layer of structure is referred to as territories. And you're seeing here the carving of Nebraska and Iowa into 7 different territories. Technically there's a little bit of territory that comes in from Illinois, but essentially we have 7 different territories that make up the Nebraska-Iowa region. Okay? Should mention that this is just a way of how we organize ourselves geographically. There are not strict fences around a particular territory. So if a person is interested in activities in another territory, the person is more than welcome to explore those activities as well. So we go by division, then we go by region, and then by territory. This is the Nebraska-Iowa Disaster Regional Office, and you have 7 different boxes right here, okay? These 7 different boxes correspond to the 7 different territories that you see up here, all right? Each of these boxes will have a disaster program manager running each of these different territories, okay? Now what I'd like to do is change the focus. Where previously we were talking about how the American Red Cross structures itself geographically. What I would like to do is focus more on the internal organization of the American Red Cross. And there are 2 different types of internal organizational structures I like to talk about in this thing that's called the Disaster Cycle Services Operational Model. When there is no immediate disaster in one's particular area, for example, and there's no particular disaster in a particular region one is having to respond to, we refer to that as the steady state. Okay? In a steady state structure, I consider the American Red Cross to do about 3 different types of activities. The first one is administrative. Basically, the American Red Cross is doing those organizational tasks that any organization has to do to keep the organization going. A second group of activities that the American Red Cross will do in a steady state is what you're seeing off this slide here, called a preparation phase. It is trying to prepare for what may be emergencies that may come up. The thinking behind this is if it can prepare for the next emergency, the better the American response, the better the American Red Cross is able to respond to that particular emergency. Okay, so that's the second task. The third task is a educational role. A lot of times the American Red Cross will do educational functions to help people, and most of those educational functions are going to be dealing with safety. When there is a crisis, when there is an emergency, the American Red Cross creates a separate structure called an operational state. It's a separate structure that is specifically created to deal with that emergency. Okay. It doesn't mean that the steady state structure has gone away. That steady state structure is still there doing its normal functions, but you will have a separate structure called an operational state that will deal with that particular disaster. Now, if the disaster is big enough, large enough, if you will, a lot of times there will be 2 different phases to the operation. Or if you want to think of it this way, there will be 2 different focuses to the operation. One of those will be the response phase. Think of it as one is responding to that particular disaster. Okay? In a response phase, the main focus of the operation in this phase is meeting people's immediate survival needs. Or if you want to personalize it, you're trying to answer the questions of where am I going to sleep tonight and where's my next meal coming from? You really are focused on providing the immediate survival needs so that people can survive. That's the main emphasis of what you're trying to do in the response phase. Imagine that you're arriving, it's chaotic, and you're trying to put those structures into place to meet people's immediate survival needs. Once things have been able to get stabilized and people's immediate survival needs have been able to be met, or if you want to personalize it, a person can basically answer their questions of where's my next meal coming from and where am I sleeping tonight. then a person is no longer focused on their immediate survival needs. In other words, they're no longer entirely focused on, very short term the needs of today and maybe needs of tomorrow. Once those survival needs have been able to be met, people are then able to start focusing on the mid to long-term futures of how to recuperate. How does one recover? And that's the next focus that the operation starts to get into. It's a recovery phase. A lot of times these will be caseworker roles, but the focus goes from meeting people's immediate survival needs to more of a focus on how do I recuperate from the disaster that just occurred? How do I recuperate from the loss of my home, car, that type of thing? And those are the two. Those again are the two different phases to the operational state. Now, if I'm a volunteer, if I was on the other end of this presentation, and I'm hearing about the internal structure of the American Red Cross, and hearing about the steady state and operational state, the steady state structure is dealing with the normal everyday operations of the American Red Cross. That's not dealing with necessarily with the disaster. And then you have the operational state structure that's dealing with a disaster. Internally in my head, I would probably be asking myself, this is great, this is nice information to know, but why are you telling me this? Why, as a volunteer, do I care about knowing the internal structures of the American Red Cross? I just want to volunteer. Why are you telling me this? The reason why knowing the internal structure of the American Red Cross is important, it is the way of how we divide volunteer positions. Should mention that a person can do both of these, but they would be classified as two separate volunteer positions. Okay? If a person is interested in responding to disasters directly, in other words, they are interested in a volunteer position in an operational state structure. Essentially what happens is a person is essentially put on call. The American Red Cross gets news that there is a disaster. The American Red Cross then calls up volunteers, and then hopefully from the American Red Cross perspective, the volunteer is available, they're able to volunteer, and then the volunteer goes and helps out with that particular disaster. Those volunteer positions are called GAPs, or otherwise referred to as group activity positions. Okay? And or a person might be interested in volunteering for the steady state structures. They're volunteering for a volunteer position that's not directly in response to a disaster, but they're more interested in helping out with the normal everyday operations of the organization. And we call those positions, well, positions, which makes sense. So a person can be in an operational state structure, or a person can be in the steady state structure. Either of these two are fine. Just realize, so a person can volunteer for both. They would just be classified as two separate volunteer positions. Okay. Now what you're seeing here is an organizational chart of an operational state structure. This is not an organizational chart of a steady state structure. Okay. The beauty of this structure is it's entirely scalable. In other words, you only will activate, if you will, these boxes if there is the need for it in a particular emergency. The thinking on this is that different emergencies will have different needs. A large hurricane will have different needs than, let's say, a local apartment fire, for example. The way this is structured is above this line are different groups or divisions, and then under that different division or group are the different activities of what that different division or group could do. And again, not all these boxes will be activated for each disaster. A local apartment fire will have different needs than, let's say, a hurricane, earthquake, forest fire, something like that. Now I should mention, it's not on the slide here, but should mention that As one begins their journey with the American Red Cross, one is always going to be starting off as a service associate. That's what we call ourselves. Essentially, you'll pick a job. We call them jobs. You essentially will pick a job of what you want to do, and therefore you'll have that job service associate. Okay. If you are interested, and there is the openings, and one shows a history of being involved with the American Red Cross, one can also be a supervisor. Okay. And then following the same pattern, if there is the openings, one shows a history with the American Red Cross and one wants to, one can also be a manager. So as a volunteer, you actually have 3 layers of the hierarchy that you can go into. You can be at the entry-level service associate position, you can also be a supervisor, and you can also be a manager. Those 3 levels in the hierarchy. Now, one of the things that we call in the American Red Cross when we are sending people to a particular disaster is we call those deployments. Okay? Deployments can either be near, in other words, they can be near your home area, or they can be far. They can be farther, somewhere outside of your home area. Okay? In general, while technically the American Red Cross will do international disasters, it is not a common occurrence. All likelihood in one's journey with the American Red Cross, one is likely to be dealing with disasters someplace in the United States. Okay? And I should mention there is no generalist position for deployment. Essentially, you will pick a particular specialization. You will pick a particular job that you will be trained in and you will do when you go off to help with deployments. So what determines how often one will be called up for a deployment? One of them is the person trained, because we want people to be trained into doing those activities. Is the person going to be available? There may be certain required documents that may be necessary and certain information in the volunteer connection profile that may need to be updated. When there is a disaster, particularly one of those larger disasters where the American Red Cross is trying to get, essentially sometimes will overload the local available resources if the disaster is big enough. Sometimes the American Red Cross will start pulling in resources from other places in the United States as to get people there quickly. Okay, one of the things that the American Red Cross will do is they will fly people to that place that has that disaster. The American Red Cross is very kind to have people volunteer. In other words, we're very happy that people are willing to spend their free time and energy to volunteer to help out with the disaster. We are not, however, expecting people to pay to arrive to the disaster location. So the flights, the lodging, and incidentals will be covered. Or I should say the majority of incidentals would be covered. The specific information on that trip to, you are being flown there, but it's not really a vacation. You are helping to donate your valuable time and you're performing a valuable service. But it's not really a vacation, but we'll call them trips. In that trip to get to that destination, we're not expecting, again, that you have to pay for it, but you will be given details about what that trip will happen to be, if you will. If we know how the lodging is structured, we will also give you information on that. Just be aware of that many times the buildings have been destroyed, or a good number of them. So technically, while it is possible that you could be staying at a motel, a lot of times you'll be staying at an emergency shelter. One of the things that the American Red Cross does is to provide emergency shelters for people. And if we do that, in all likelihood, you'll also be staying at an emergency shelter as well. If one is able to agree to help out, we generally ask people to be able to leave within about 24 hours at the time of acceptance. Okay. If the disaster is big enough where we are transporting people to a particular disaster, we generally will ask for a 2-week commitment. Now, why 2 weeks? A couple reasons for that. The first one is a cost containment issue. It really is not cost effective to have a person agree to volunteer to help out. We fly the person to a destination. The person does a marvelous job of volunteering in the afternoon, and then we fly the person back later that same day in the evening. We really want people to make a 2-week commitment to be able to stay there. Another reason we found 2 weeks to be effective is we've kind of found that to be a good time period where people are committed, otherwise they wouldn't be going. But it's a way that people feel like they're making a difference, they're helping out, but they don't get exhausted. Now, it is my understanding that a person can volunteer more than 2 weeks, but there would be some period of rest between the time periods. The one exception to this, or an exception that I know of anyway, is if you're in health services or mental health services. It's the same idea where you're having to commit to a certain fixed period of time, but it's on a 10-day cycle rather than 2 weeks. Okay, and then here are some of the pictures showing some of the varieties of the American Red Cross. This slide here, I just show people that here is again a wide variety of all the different activities that the American Red Cross is involved in. You'll be essentially would be taking classes online. Okay. One of the things that we ask people to be trained in is something called a sheltering service associate. We're asking everybody to be trained as a sheltering service associate. Now, I should mention here is that if that's an activity that has absolutely no interest, you don't want to do a sheltering service associate, that's perfectly fine. Then think of it as getting trained in learning more about a particular activity that the American Red Cross does. Okay? You're learning more about a background of about a major activity that the American Red Cross does. The secondary advantage of getting this training is, like I said previously, if you're going to one of those larger disasters where we're transporting you, a lot of times you'll be staying at emergency shelters. So one of the advantages of this training is you get to learn more about the background of how shelters operate. One of the reasons we ask people to get trained as a sheltering service associate is if there is a disaster and the disaster is big enough, we will often find the need to have sheltering service associates would be rather large. So the idea here is we can get the training done ahead of time rather than trying to quickly train people really quickly when there is the need. One of the instruments that you will work with as a volunteer is something referred to as the volunteer connection. I think of the volunteer connection as your website. Now, all technical purposes aside, it's not technically your website. You do not actually own it. But I consider it to be a personalized website that helps you in your journey with the American Red Cross. It gives you one place on the internet where you can access the majority of the volunteer resources rather than trying to go through, like, I don't know, we'll just say 12,000 online systems located in a variety of different places. The way this is structured is it will have the Nebraska-Iowa chapter. You'll have a menu here of different options. So essentially you move your mouse over the link and it will then show for most of these anyway, it will show a short menu of different options. You'll have some photographs that will rotate, or you can manually rotate them, about 6 or 7 photographs that will rotate. You'll have your name, you can put your portrait here, and then again some links underneath here. The two resources I want to explore here is the way to add your hours and the edge system. Again, you have the add hours and then the edge system here. Okay. Let's explore how to add your hours. So if you click on the add hours, what you get is sort of a pop-up window. This is a pop-up window that will sort of appear in the middle. Hopefully you can see the outline here. It will sort of appear in the volunteer connection here. Okay. Couple of information about of entering your hours. As a volunteer, you may ask yourself, I'm a volunteer here. Why are you asking me to put in my hours? What is this? One of the reasons that we ask people to put in volunteer hours is it is one mechanism that we can determine who's still active. We are a very, if you will, volunteer-focused, centered organization, and we have many different volunteers. By recording the volunteer hours, it is one mechanism that we can tell who's still active. Okay, so let's say a person agrees to volunteer, let's say 1 day a month for the American Red Cross, and then we find that the person has been volunteering for the last 3 months. We would probably consider that person to be then inactive status for that volunteer with the American Red Cross. Doesn't mean that the person can't come back. All likelihood that the person could still come back to the American Red Cross, but just in that time frame, they're just not being involved with the American Red Cross. A second reason that we find volunteer hours to be important is we talked about how up early in this presentation, let me get to that here, is the importance of generosity of donors. Donors are, both of these, the volunteers and then the donors are very important to the American Red Cross. One way to express to donors that we are, I guess you call it good shepherds, or there's a better word for here, but essentially we are being good stewards is the terminology I'm trying to think of. I'm sorry. We are being good stewards of the financial resources that donors are willing to donate. Because remember, the donors are willing to give their not free money, but they're willing to give their hard-earned money that they took time and energy and work to get, and they are purposely giving it to the American Red Cross, so the American Red Cross has the financial means to do all the activities that the American Red Cross does. As a way to say thank you, one of the things we will do is we will communicate to those donors that here's the number of totality of the hours that donors have donated. Now, I think it can be done by the organization total. It can be done by by chapters. I think they can also do it by particular specialty areas based upon what the donor's interest happens to be. I'm not 100% sure on that, but I believe so anyway. But there's a lot of useful information knowing the total number of donors that can be helpful. Now, what counts as hours is actually rather broad. Obviously, the activities that you volunteer for, we call it work, but the work that you're doing counts. This orientation will count. The classes that you take online will count. But even if you're talking to a friend about the American Red Cross and you are talking about all the activities that you're doing, and you're doing that at McDonald's or over the phone or a coffee shop or through Zoom, that will count as well. Okay. Now, when you do these activities, we do need to record the hours. For example, if you do an online class, the system will not automatically post those hours in the timekeeping system. You do need to post those hours in there. Okay. A little bit of information about putting information in the time clock. I think it's sort of self-explanatory. You have your date, you have the minutes, the hours, and the activity and stuff. One thing that people should know is that the hours and minutes are two separate boxes. It's not all the same box. So if one volunteers, let's say, a minute and 35 minutes, you put a 1 in the one box and then 35 in the minute box. Or if you donate, I don't know, hour and 42 minutes. We'll use the example of 42 for anyone that knows that internal joke from the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Universe. Let's say you do an hour and 1 minute, and so essentially you would put 1 in the hour box and 42 in the minute box. If you donate less than an hour, you put the minutes in the minute box, but you still have to put a 0 in the 0 box. Otherwise, it doesn't work. Okay? If you don't put a 0 in the 0 box and you fill it all in and you hit submit, it's just going to stare at you. So you do need to put something in the 0. You do need to put a 0 in that hour box to make it work. Now, I was talking about how you need to put in the time for the stuff that you do, or we suggest anyway. We recommend it. Some people will put in the time as soon as they do the activity. Sometimes people will do like 2, 3, or 4 activities and then put it all in one time. All that is fine. The general guideline that we generally will have is that we would like to have people put in the time in the same month that you're doing the activity, just to try to avoid a person putting in an activity, let's say 3 months after the activity occurred. It doesn't mean that the system won't accept it and we won't accept it, but it's just a way to better organize what are the volunteer activities that have occurred during that month if everyone can put in that activity in the same month that it occurred. This does not mean, however, that if you do an activity, let's say on the 29th, the 30th, or the 31st of the month, that you can't put in the activity on the 1st, 2nd, or 3rd of the next month. We're not saying that. But generally, if it is all possible, we kind of like to have people put in the activity in the same month that it occurred. Now, I was talking about how you have to record the activity of, we want people to record the time frames of the activities that occurred. The one exception that I know of, and I don't know if you can read this here up here, but it says at the very top, please do not submit disaster relief operation hours. If you're going off to one of those more larger disaster organizations, let's say you're helping out with a hurricane, for example, the hurricane that affected Florida recently, it isn't really good use of one's time to try to find a computer, to try to find internet resource to record the hours that you did for that particular day. Particularly if you're just showing up, you're focused on trying to meet people's survival needs. The recording of time is actually, a very small importance. And actually, in those situations, probably should not be important at all. Because the internet, computers might be a scarcity, the internet might be down. It just doesn't really make sense for people to record hours in those disaster situations, particularly at the beginning when you are trying to meet people's survival needs. So, as a way to adjust to that, the American Red Cross is, when you're going off to those disasters, will register that you went and essentially would just assume that you volunteered 10 hours that day. It will automatically just be put in the system. So that's the one case I know of where you do not need to put in hours when you're doing those type of operations. Okay. The next resource I'd like to look at is something referred to as Edge. Okay, you get the Edge right here. Essentially what you do is you click on Edge, and then you get to a screen that I consider it to be a person on the mountain. Sometimes I've seen a picture of a body of water. I can't tell if it's ocean or lake, but you have a picture of nature here, and then you can either click on My Transcript or My Training. Either of these two will get you to a slide like this. And essentially what you do is you can click on the course, or you can click on, I sometimes pronounce this as lunch, okay, but essentially you can launch your course. I guess if you want to have lunch at the same time where you're taking your course, you can do that as well. But that's the whole beauty of having these courses online, is that you can essentially take them anywhere you want to, at any time you want to. So if you want to take it 3 o'clock in the afternoon, you can do that. Or if you want to take it at 3 o'clock in the morning, you can do that. Any place where you can get access to the internet. The classes are not in any particular order. You can take the classes in any particular order that you want. And you can start a class, and let's say you don't have enough time to complete that particular course. No problem. There will be places in that course that will save it, and then you can come back and come to the part that you left. You won't have to retake the part of the course that you already did already. So that's really cool. Now, what to expect from us when this is over, when this presentation is over. If this was a live presentation, okay, what often happens is I will, or whoever's presenting this presentation, will arrive to the classroom. We'll call it virtual classroom because this is given online, but we'll arrive to the virtual classroom early. I try usually to arrive about 15 minutes before the actual classroom. And as people enter the classroom, we will sometimes, well, not sometimes, but we will get into a discussion as to what area of interest they would like to go into. So that's what this is talking about here, confirming the areas of interest. We really do want people to enjoy their time with the American Red Cross. Okay? We know people are volunteers. And I should probably mention, if you start volunteering for an activity that really isn't something that interests you, let us know so that maybe we can find another activity that may interest you. People's free time with their work, family, and other obligations can be rather small. So it is unlikely that a person who's volunteering with the American Red Cross, if it's a volunteer position that they really don't enjoy doing, they're probably not going to volunteer. They're probably going to go find something else that they find rewarding with their free time. So if you start volunteering in something that really doesn't work for you, let us know and see if we can find another volunteer position that might work for you. Another, I guess, side note to that is if you are looking at the American Red Cross, if your entire journey at this point has been looking at the American Red Cross as an outsider, and you may know certain features, like for example, you may know that the American Red Cross does something with the blood drive. You may have heard about blood drive, for example, that was somehow connected to the American Red Cross, but you really don't know that much about it. We kind of give the advice to give yourself about 6 months to a year to kind of know, if you will, the full flavor of all the different activities that the American Red Cross does. It really just takes a while to kind of learn all the activities that the American Red Cross is involved in. Okay? So, with that being said, what you're going to get to at the end of this presentation is a next step email. Yes, I am doing this a live recording here, so there are going to be these little snafus here and there, but welcome to recorded presentations, I guess. But essentially, you're going to receive next step email from volunteers like Doug, Barbara, it could be somebody else. And in that next step email, I was kind of going to give you a guide chart of what is going to happen after this presentation. We usually try to get it out within about a week's time after a person has completed a presentation. In this email, we're going to give you, if you will, some onboarding requests to complete. One of them is to complete the assigned trainings. Essentially, there's going to be about 3 months that we are asking a person to complete about 8 hours of training. Okay. We're going to ask people to be able to complete a headshot photo for ID badge. We're going to ask people to complete a wellness agreement in some positions. One of the reasons that we ask people to complete a wellness agreement is it can be very valuable for the Red Cross to know, if you will, about people's limitations. And what I mean by that is the last thing we want people to do, because they're being generous in volunteering their time to help other people in responding to a disaster, is that people get hurt. So if a person, let's say, has back problems, well, we probably don't want to have the person lifting heavy items, for example. Or if a person has asthma, we probably shouldn't send the person off to be a part of the operation to help with a forest fire, for example. It's just a mechanism, or one mechanism, to keep everybody safe and people don't get injured. There are some positions that, let's say, a doctor, nurse, mental health counselor, that requires a professional license to be able to do those professional work activities in their professional jobs. The American Red Cross has those same, I'm not sure if they're entirely equivalent, but essentially they're about the same positions as volunteers. Okay? To be able to do those volunteer professional jobs of, let's say, in the medical health areas or mental health areas, something like that require a license to be able to do it professionally as a paid professional, we also will need to see the license as a volunteer. So if you're one skilled in those areas and would like to, help out in that way, we will need to see that professional license for you to do those type of positions. Most areas will have meetings, and I believe those meetings are about once a month. You're not required to go to those meetings, but we do recommend that you go to those meetings as just a way to know more about what the American Red Cross is, and just to know more about us and know about the people that donate their time with the American Red Cross. The other thing that you will see in this email is it will have information of how you can connect to a supervisor or mentor. We call them both. A lot of times I hear it referred to as supervisors, but can also refer to as mentors. Either name works. We recommend a person to be in contact, and we encourage communication to your supervisor. This is a person that you use as one way to learn more about what the American Red Cross does. Okay. And finally, if you have a similar brain like mine, a lot of times one will not have questions during the actual orientation itself, but one will have questions after the orientation. So this is a resource that you can do, or one resource that you can do to ask questions about the American Red Cross and get answers. During the live presentations, I encourage people to copy this information down, do like a screenshot, or have time to record the information so that the information is available for people to record the information if they need it. But depending upon how you want to access it, you can either call the Disaster Workforce Engagement, either at 515-471-8360, or one can write an email at neiadisastersupport@redcross.org. Either of these two resources will work. Okay, so you can go access them both that way. And that's the presentation. This is a presentation of the American Red Cross. Again, we do thank you very much for your time and volunteering with the American Red Cross. You help the American Red Cross in its vital mission in helping to reduce human suffering, and we really do appreciate you spending your free time to be part of the American Red Cross journey. And thank you very much for listening to this presentation. And enjoy the rest of your weekend, day, or night, or whenever you're hearing this presentation. Thank you.